Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you to this community forum this evening with regard to the fire and rescue services, especially as it pertains to the city of Littleton and also to the city of Englewood. We'll be conducting a similar forum tomorrow evening with the residents of the city of Englewood, so we hope to get some good input from both communities. By way of introduction, my name is Jim Broman, and I'm one of the team members, one of 3 team members that have been primarily assigned to this particular project. And colleague Martin Goffner is the project manager, and he'll be addressing you a little bit later on with some of the initial findings and results that we've accomplished so far. And my job initially is to sort of set the framework, set the stage, provide a framework for what we're doing and where we are in the process right now. It is really important, I think, to any community that the members of the community have the opportunity to participate in what goes on, what decisions are made, the direction that's taken for that particular community. It's quite apparent that the decisions are made by the council members. I know we're fortunate to have, I think, at least one of the council members from the city of Littleton here tonight, Peggy Cole. And if I missed any other council members? Just came in. Welcome. We're just getting started, so we're glad to have 2 of the council members here. There's a multifold purpose for why we do community involvement. One of them is just simply for your awareness, so that you know what the issues are that are going on in your community, whether it has to do with fire or transportation or parks or law enforcement, whatever it might be. Some of those issues sometimes are highly controversial, sometimes they're not so much. So we're glad that even though there may not have been a large number of headlines about this, that you have chosen to spend your time this evening looking into this particular issue. Another reason for it, hopefully, is for us as consultants and also for the government itself, for the council and the administration, to provide to you credible information. I know that it probably doesn't happen in this community, but I know where I live, there's a fair amount of information that moves around the community in what we affectionately refer to as the rumor mill. And it gets passed from place to place, and it seems to evolve and change as it goes through different communication points. And sometimes it's not always as accurate as it could be or it should be. Hopefully tonight we're able to provide you with some good, credible information. We'd also like to make you aware that there may be some potential decisions coming before the council, before the elected officials, as it pertains to fire and rescue services for the community, so that you have a sense of what's happening, when that will happen, and that if and when you have input, you have the opportunity to weigh on that. This is also an opportunity for you to give input, to ask questions, to find out what you need to know in order to make your decision or to give good input. So we will have the opportunity to do that in just a couple of minutes, but we're going to go through some informative pieces first of all. Martin and I are here as part of the ESCI team, which is Emergency Services Consulting International, and that's a firm that is based as 2 principal bases, one in Oregon and one in the East Coast. And we provide consulting services principally to fire and emergency medical services agencies, but also to law enforcement, to dispatch centers, and some other areas of public safety services. Quite a history there. If any of you know Jack Snook, who is the founder and the president of that organization, a very dynamic leader in this particular industry. And it's been a pleasure for me, and I'm sure for Martin, to work with Jack and to be able to be involved in that. Just a bit of background for myself. I spent 45 years in the public fire service, working in the state of Michigan and also suburban Chicago. I was fortunate enough to spend about 8 years as the fire chief of the city of Englewood back in the 70s. Seems like such a long time ago. It was back when Chief Patarozzi did not have gray hair. So. And then I moved on to a fire district in the state of Washington, in the western Washington area, just south of Seattle. I was there for 22 years and just retired about 2 years ago. And this is an opportunity to continue my involvement with something that I really respect and enjoy, like being a part of. And so I'm glad to be here and be able to share in this process. As you look on the screen, you see the words Cooperative Efforts Feasibility Study. It's a long term for what we're doing, and perhaps it'd be worthwhile just talking a little bit about what that is and what it means. The City of Littleton and the City of Englewood have a very apparent history of successful cooperative working relationships between the two cities, and also other agencies in the South Metro area. So this is not a new concept in this particular region or this particular part of the Denver metro area. It has demonstrated value, it's demonstrated functionality. But when you look at the word cooperative, obviously the word in its entirety speaks to the issue of working together to accomplish a common goal. But I think we've probably heard the term, well, I've been co-opted in that process. And where does that come from? What's the meaning behind that? Well, you've been co-opted, you've given up something. And the reality is when you go into most cooperative arrangements, agreements, and working relationships, you did give up some of your independence. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, it's just something that's a reality of what goes on. And I think for most of us, as long as what we give up or sacrifice or put on the table is not greater than our comfort level and we get a return on that, we stay with that relationship. When it gets out of balance, then we tend to break up and go apart and want to go back to independent. I think there's fairly clear evidence over many, many decades that cooperative relationships between agencies, governments, and all that, from an efficiency standpoint, make a lot of sense. But it's that balance between, am I comfortable with what's happening, am I comfortable with the outcomes, versus how efficient it is. So as these two cities began to look at this issue and ask the questions, is there more that we could be doing, they decided to bring in a third party to help with that process, and that's where we come into the mix. It's, come on in. It is a real significant opportunity for us to look at the issues that lie before us. It's significant because of what's going on in our world, in our economy, in our society in general. I think most people in the room are fairly aware, maybe not to the extent of magnitude, of the pressure that's come to bear on local government. And it really doesn't matter what particular service you're talking about. If you're talking about schools, if you're talking about parks, transportation systems, public safety, whatever it is, the amount of money that's been available in the past has simply eroded, and it's not there. And the cost of doing business has not followed the same path. The cost of doing business continues to inch up. Even though inflation rate's down, there's still a cost. And so we get to the place where we begin talking about is the current operation, the way we're doing business, is it sustainable? In other words, can we continue on the same course, spending and delivering services as we are today, based on what's happening with our revenue? Vast majority of local governments are finding out that those lines either have already crossed or they soon will cross, and it will no longer be sustainable without some changes. And the changes are fairly basic. You either add more revenue, more money to the equation, you reduce your expenses, or find some alternative way to deliver the service. So that's a big part of our role here, is to look at the operations of both the City of Littleton and the City of Englewood Fire and Rescue Services and give them some third-party perspective. Are the operations today, are they sustainable? What are you doing that's working? What are you doing that maybe isn't working, doesn't need to be done anymore, could be done differently? And then what are the opportunities for cooperative services? And there's, as we work through this process, there's a fairly extensive list that's beginning to develop. And as we begin to look at that list, the opportunities there begin to coalesce around different types of governance structures that could be put in place to make that successful. Just by way of example, there's the possibility of merging or consolidation. There's the possibilities of contracts. There's the possibilities of a larger government such as a fire authority. And there's a number of those that are beginning to emerge as having different possibilities. And I think for most of us, if you're new to this, you're saying, what is this all about? I don't understand that. And that's the purpose of the report. When it comes out, is to give you all the information to say, is what we're doing today, is it sustainable? If not, what are the things that we could do to keep it sustainable? What changes do we have to make? And are there opportunities out there to organize and to manage and administer these programs in a way that works better? The bottom line is what works better for the community. What is in the best interest of the community? That brings us to why we have things like community forums and asking for your input. Ultimately, your council members will make that decision. Tonight we're going to talk in general, but probably a little more specifically about Littleton, because that's the community that we're dealing with here. And what we're going to do is have Martin provide you with an overview of the current service and operation picture that we have to date. Let me tell you that what we're doing at this point is still very much in draft form. And one of the reasons it's in draft form is because we do not have citizen input into that report at this point. So we're toward the latter stages of the project. We've completed most of the quantitative and qualitative assessments, have put together a lot of data. We're probably talking in a report in volume of several hundred pages probably at this point, so it's going to be a pretty substantial document. But as a result, when we get to that point, we'll have some good information that you can look at either in detail or in summary fashion. But it is still in draft, so we're not able to provide that because the report goes first to the elected bodies of the two cities before it becomes a public document. So we're holding off on actually distributing information until we get the citizen input. We got to go back and then we begin to finalize some of the impacts as far as costs and the recommendations that are coming forward. So Martin, if you would come up and talk to us a little bit about the current service and operation. After he's done, we'll open it for a period of question and answer where you can get your questions answered about what Martin's talked about the process, any of those types of things. And then we'll finish with an opportunity for you to provide input and comments.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with you. My microphone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. As Jim had said, there's a tremendous amount of information that goes into the background of a project like this that is supplied to us by the individual departments that we use as a basis for fact of what the departments look like today. We take that information, we bring that together. We also use our personal experience as well as our experiences with other organizations or like organizations. And we bring that into the mix. We take a look at national standards, regional standards, local standards that apply to fire and emergency services in your communities. For one, there's a difference between the requirements and the authorities for a fire department as there are different for a fire district. Some of the complexities that we've dealt with in this process had to do with that we do have a fire district as well, and that we have Littleton Fire Protection District is provided service by Littleton Fire and Rescue, as well as Highland Ranch, the Metropolitan District. We look broader than just the two organizations and the two organizations that contract. We reach out further than that in that we talked as well with the neighboring agencies to find out their perspective, so we were able to get a holistic view of the entire service area. The report itself, a lot of it is background information, and one of the things that we were able to do is to take information that we had already on Littleton from a prior study and incorporate it into this report and update it so that it was current. There's a couple of ways we could have went with the report, and we could have written an introduction to a section, discussed what we found within the organizations, and then show the comparison and then draw a conclusion. That's very labor intensive, and frankly, it's not a lot of fun for you to read. So for the base information, what we did is we wrote an introduction to each section, and then we put in a side-by-side format what one organization does and what the other does, so that you're able to look and see what their governance model is. You're able to see the number of staffing, the number of people in each position, their budgets, how they approach training, how they approach fire prevention, communications, on down through the list. It's about 120 pages of information, just baseline information. The report layout, as you see there, the first part is all dedicated to the evaluation of current conditions and how things look. More on that and more. When we get to this part, we're able to take all of that baseline information, and then with the information that's provided from the stakeholders, and that includes the community forums, we're able to respond to that and say, well, here's some opportunities that exist for the organizations as they go forward. It's not just taking and saying, well, this will fit, because we're hoping to answer with the questions that we ask and the answers you give us, we answer back and say, well, here's an opportunity for cost avoidance. Here's an opportunity to improve service. Here's an opportunity for efficiencies, and draw those out. It isn't a simple black and white, this is one answer and this is the only way to go. There are, in fact, times when we say, this is probably not the right time for the organizations to go together and create a single organization. That happens sometimes. But there's always an opportunity for efficiencies that can be gained. Never have I found one where there were not efficiencies to be gained. When we looked at it, when we get to the last part, what we developed is the list of overarching strategy or options. What are the options that are available to them? Some of the options that are available to a city aren't to a fire district, and vice versa. Colorado has laws that allow fire authorities, which is unique to only a few states in the country, but it allows for a more regional approach to the provision of fire and emergency services. Fire and emergency services don't necessarily follow geopolitical boundary lines real well. Rivers, highways, annexations all work to change the boundaries of cities. And it's hard to plan just for an individual city. It's often better to plan regionally. And in the case of Littleton, with Highlands Ranch and Littleton Fire Protection District, they've been able to do that. I brought it up several times that there are fire station locations that are perfectly suited to serve the three agencies, but if they were just for one of the three, they would not be so good. The same way of the deployment of resources, the apparatus. They're able to provide a service over a broader area rather than in just a small encapsulated area, and capture some of those efficiencies. When we went beyond looking at what they could do governance-wise of going together, we provided them with a number of options that they can look at that are more at the functional level, that are operations or business type ways of that they can approach things. So that'd be options as well. And then we will write the findings, recommendations, and the preferred options. But that has not been completed until we have all of our information. I wanted to give you an example of the baseline information, how it's laid out. For in the section about governance, how are the organizations governed? It just rules and roles and lines of authority, how they're laid out. There's a number of questions that go down, describe it side by side, and you can look at that as you move through. When we did the environmental scan, which is talking to the stakeholders, and this will be similar to what we do with the information we receive over the next couple of nights, we address where are some of the strengths of the organizations. And the numbers next to them indicate the number of times that we heard that response from stakeholders. So City of Inglewood and Inglewood Fire Department, one of the things they said was they had a quick response, and that was mentioned to us 5 different times. If we look over in the next column, talking about the strong culture of customer service and pride and ownership, we have all of those listed, as well as the weaknesses, the opportunities, the challenges, and the critical issues, and we try and address each of those as we move through the report. Interestingly enough, Inglewood and Littleton could agree on something with all the stakeholders, that finances and financial issues were the number one thing that came to the top for both in all of the stakeholders that we spoke with. In the report, besides those tables, there's a lot of information that you can look at to see where the staffing levels are, how they line up, and a discussion that says, here's how they're addressing their staffing for administration and support, for training, for fire prevention, and it goes along with each of the figures and topic areas. Emergency operations staffing, the number of personnel. So now you have the question answered there on the survey. You don't have to look that one up. We also did a very in-depth analysis of the finances, because if we look at an organization, how are they going to be sustainable long-term? For each of them, we looked at it in the broad sense of what it takes to operate all of their functions, and then broke it down into what it takes to operate the different components. Because in the instance of Littleton, there is not just the permitting and plans review, there's also the enterprise fund for the ambulance service, as well as the fire department, that have different sources of revenue and amounts that they use to pay those services. So we took a look at it historically for 5 years to see what changes have occurred over that period of time. And we did that in depth for all of the different areas in both revenue and expenditures. As you saw, the first one, and then the second is to do with operations of the fire department. And then expenditures. And interesting to look, we look at things like what's been happening as far as expenditures, what's trends going like, and what is the reason for that? Has there been a change? Has there been a decrease in the amount of service, a decrease in the service area? It's not one piece of information. So the information that we look at is merely interesting when we look at one by itself, but when we take the staffing, the number of calls, the budgets, the services provided, time of day when calls occur, and bring that all together, it gives us a picture of the entire service area. Each statistic by itself is merely interesting, but we hope to paint a picture that gives you an idea of what the entire service looks like. Another component we look at is how are they going to sustain replacing capital? Not only apparatus, but capital equipment. The breathing apparatus they use, all of the other equipment, as well as the fire stations, maintaining them. They're very expensive enterprises to keep going. You can't just buy a station and let it go. If you do, the value of it will be gone in a number of years. This is just part of the capital replacement cost projection for the Littleton Fire and Rescue. I excerpted out, but the numbers on the bottom there are the numbers for the entire amount. It's $3.3 million would be required today if the fund was fully funded to replace capital. and requires a contribution annually of about $478,000 to replace just the capital apparatus. Looking at a forecast of summary for fire operations, this is not the ambulance or the permitting. Take a look at, as it moves out forward, we look at the expenditures and we projected it out 5 years. So we have a history, we have a projection. I don't think I had it there. Also within there, we have a number of maps. There's probably 20, 25 maps in there that give you a view of where the stations are located, where the apparatus are at, how many people you can have on a fire incident scene within a given amount of time. Those are all parameters. This one takes a look at the incidents that occurred within a 12-month period in the Littleton and Inglewood area, and it includes Highlands Ranch and Littleton Fire Protection District. And if you look at it, you can see where the areas where there's a high incidence rate. But over the whole area, what it's telling us is that there are areas where it's really rainy, but there isn't any area that where it isn't raining a little bit. It's like Doppler radar, and it gives us an idea where we need to focus our efforts at. And the pockets with the highest concentration are obviously the areas where the highest service demand is. As part of that, we look at what's service demand doing. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying static? How is it shifting? And looking back historically, it has been increasing some. And is it shifting? Is it more fire? Is it more EMS? And where is that based at and how it's broken out? You look there and you see that Inglewood's EMS percentage is a little bit higher. And we look at that and go, okay, why? Well, one of the reasons is that Inglewood also does the non-emergent transports. And we know that it's proposed that Littleton would begin doing that in January 1st of this coming year. We have to figure that in. How will that impact Littleton? How will that impact Inglewood? And also, how will it impact the neighbors? We saw today that the statistics that last year, I believe it was 475 of the transports for Littleton Fire Rescue were provided by South Metro. They did that number of transports out of this area. How will that be impacted in the coming year? Will that go up? How will that be addressed? Service demand by time of day. Where are the calls occurring? Well, within Inglewood and Littleton Fire Rescue, about 67, 66% of the calls happen within a 12-hour period. So that means between 7 at night and 7 in the morning, a little over 30% of the calls. There's a typical bell curve to that. And what we want to see is, does the service demand line up with our resources? And what happens when we're our busiest? Are we having times when we're having a longer response time because we're having more than one call, 2 calls, 3 calls at a time? So we'll analyze, or we actually did analyze that. We take a look at how busy the units are. How many hours or what percent of the day are they involved in activities related to emergency response? We know that when they get to a certain level, that it's a point where you need to look at redeploying or adding another resource or changing the way that you deliver the service. And I mentioned just a moment ago about the times that you have concurrent calls. Well, we know that 40% of the time, Littleton Fire Rescue is having one incident that occurs at a time. So a little quick math means that 60% of the time, Littleton Fire Rescue has more than one incident occurring at a time. And in fact, 2% of the time, there's 5 or more calls occurring. Part of the equation. The next part of the equation is how many units are deployed on incidents. Well, single apparatus go on 21% of the calls, so that means that 78, 79% of the time there's more than one apparatus committed. So if we've got 2% of the time where we've got 5 or more calls going, and we know that a big percentage of the time we have 2 or more apparatus, there's only so many units in the system. How do you manage that? How do you account for that? And how do you adapt to that? We use response time as a measure, how quick we get there. If we're not in quarters, if we're not able to respond because we're on another call and the unit has to come from a greater distance, it takes a little longer. The measure that used to be used was average. What's average? Most people think average is pretty good. In the fire and emergency medical services, that's not good enough. And in fact, now we measure it by a fractile or a percentile, generally in the 80, 85, 90% range for calls. So this takes a look and shows you the average. The average response time is 6 minutes, 29 seconds. But the 90th percentile, that means 90 out of 100 calls are answered in 9 minutes and 15 seconds. There's a difference there. We look at those and we also try and find out what the difference is and how those things occur. We showed it by the different types of services, what the call time was, the average, 80th and 90th percentile. Once we have all this information together, we put up some overarching strategies at the governance level to see what would be possible. These are not necessarily ones that are feasible, but what are possible for the agencies to do. And we've come up with a number of strategies. And the first one I'd like to just call out, I won't go through them all, but is status quo. Looking at status quo, is status quo possible in the future? And our preliminary answer is that it's not sustainable long term, that there needs to be some changes. If the agencies in the future determine that they still would be independent, that is okay. But we believe that there are a number of opportunities for cooperative efforts, strategic initiatives we call them, that can be used to help improve the service, gain efficiencies, and for future cost avoidance. So far we have developed 42 of those that are in the report. How they're laid out is this is the status quo one. They're in a format where you can break them down. The summary is in a table, so you can take a look at where the cooperation is. Status quo, it's not a governance, it's not an administration, it's not a policy. It's just we're going to continue the way we are and we're going to do some things functionally together. What's the timeline for it? It's a short term, something that can be done relatively quickly. Who does it impact? In this case, it impacts operations. And some of it impacts the emergency medical services, some it's logistics and support, and the agencies. In this case, it's just Englewood Fire and Littleton Fire Rescue. A number of them include neighboring agencies, as some include police, some include the communication center. Then we go on, and what are the objectives? Why are we doing it? Is it just something we threw on the wall? Well, no, in fact, these are the reasons for it. We go on and give a summary, just a brief description of what we're trying to accomplish with it. And here's one of the strategic initiatives laid out. And I was able to put a little more information in there. Level of cooperation, timeline, section emergency operations, who's it affect? And in this case, it consider expanding it, the scope of the strategy to include West and South Metro. What are the objectives? It's followed by a summary, and then there's a discussion, guidance from our experience as well as professionals, as well as from standards. Fiscal considerations, what are the monetary, what are the soft costs of doing any one of these strategic initiatives? And what are the policy actions that have to go in that? What are the, is required of the City Council? What's required of the agencies that work with, for instance, Littleton Fire and Rescue? The review committee, do they need to be involved? How does that go about? So that is done for all 42 of those. And you thought I was going to go on forever, but not. Thank you.
Comes to your time now for you to ask some questions. Ultimately, we're going to ask you for some input, your thoughts about this whole process. But you may need to ask a question about some of the material Martin presented. You may ask a question about the process, how we're accomplishing this. We have some distinguished members of the fire staff here that we can put on the spot and ask questions as well. But principally, what are your questions for us? And because we are broadcasting on TV, If you have a question, if you'd raise your hand, and I'm going to come and visit you with a microphone so we can capture all that, and you can pass it along to your family as well. Any questions?
Specifically, what are you going to recommend as a way of efficiencies from a combination of the departments?
The last part for the accommodation?
What you said was there were efficiencies to be gained by combining the departments. What specific efficiencies and cost savings do you see? Reducing administration or cutting fire stations?
You want to address that? Sure.
The overarching strategies that you saw, we haven't developed the basis of the financial forecasting on those, so we haven't developed a recommendation. I mentioned about efficiencies. Some of them that we have in the strategic initiatives that are outside of the governance area include things like training, bringing that together as one unit, in that the cities have already gone together with some other departments and they have a training center. So there are efficiencies to be gained by using a single training manual, a training plan, working together on that. Besides that, there are some staffing and deployment issues that we brought up as potential opportunities. So rather than deploying resources just on a city by city, but looking at it more globally and regionally, as I mentioned, there'll be an impact when a change is made within the Littleton Fire Rescue as far as transporting on non-emergency transports. It's not limited to what happens in Littleton Fire and Rescue. So it would behoove the agencies to look at it more globally for the deployment of medic units, of paramedics and other resources, so that you can maintain a high level of coverage. So we have a description of different methods that can be used there.
I guess you're still not answering the question, or maybe getting around it. If you're talking about reducing training manuals or the save cost, things that lead to reduction of personnel, does it not?
The question was, if we're recommending that initiative was that they could have a single training manual rather than having two of them, and the result would be a reduction in staff?
Well, if you're talking efficiencies, it has to translate to the dollar.
Correct. But it isn't always dollars. I'll bring up Inglewood right here now. For some of their administration staff, they've had some reductions over the past couple of years. And if you take a position that's having to do more than one job function, if you're able to free up some time, you can focus more energy on, for the example we're talking about, on active training of fire and EMS personnel versus having to spend it on administrative duties as far as creating a manual, updating policies, and so forth. So there may not be a dollar amount in it, but there's an efficiency to be gained in that you can use a portion of the full-time equivalency, your staff person, in a different area as opposed to administrative function. That's just one example.
So your recommendation is efficiency that doesn't translate into dollars?
On that specific one, there's, as I said, there's 42 different ones, and some have a dollar amount attached to them. Actually, some cost some money to do, but there's a payoff in it in the end. Some are just efficiencies in operation. For example, we talk about drop boundaries for response. And what that is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is if you have an incident in one place, whoever happens to be the closest unit goes, and it doesn't matter if it's Inglewood, South Metro, West Metro, or Littleton Fire and Rescue, to provide the best level of service. You do have to monitor that so it doesn't become one-sided and you're giving all and not receiving back in kind. But there are times when that is a benefit to the citizens that you serve. You can provide a better service by using a drop boundary response versus having to be in a unit from your organization.
Doesn't that happen now?
Not in all instances, no. There are some agencies that are not participating, and in some, it requires a request. It's not automatic.
Yes. Go.
I'm used to traveling to the microphone. I've got questions, three-part question about Trailmark. Have you considered the response times to Trailmark in light of Trailmark? For those that don't know, it's in Jefferson County, almost directly opposite from Inglewood. When you started considering this consolidation, it seems like the choice was a partner that is furthest away from being able to improve service to Trailmark. I've watched City Council struggle, and I've seen the citizens come in for several years regarding issues at Trailmark. The political background makes it difficult to get a fire station there. There was an agreement with West Metro. I believe that ended. I don't know if one's back in place, but obviously agreements can come and go. And there most recently was issues of insurance cost at Trailmark because of the rating, because of the response times related to the distance to the nearest fire station. So why did you go into this considering only Inglewood, if that's what you did? You spoke of a holistic, reach farther and holistic approach. So I would be interested to know how you're addressing Trailmark. For the record, I live in Mr. Taylor's district, very close here. I'm not from Trailmark, but I've watched this as a difficulty for many years. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And yes, we are addressing it. Initially, the two partners that came and contracted with us to do this study were Inglewood and Littleton Fire and Rescue, which included Highlands Ranch and Littleton Fire Protection District. When we did the initial work here, we didn't limit it to those. We did also spend time with West Metro, South Metro, Cunningham, I don't remember who all else. And yes, that was addressed during the study as far as the response times to Trailmark. There's another area as well out there. And the city has already taken some actions in looking into that. And our recommendations will be such that, yes, that needs to be addressed, and also providing options and recommendations on how that can be covered. It wasn't overlooked. The initial two agencies that contracted with us to work with this study didn't put any boundaries on us. They didn't say, well, don't look at that option. In fact, when we asked that question, they were very open and said, everything is on the table. However you feel we can best serve the community, and it doesn't have to be limited to the option of just the two agencies. So yes, we are addressing that, and we will have that in a report, and we've spoken with West Metro as well as South Metro and the others. And it's not just limited to emergency response. It goes into the broader sense, and we're looking at other avenues that may be able to have cooperative and collaboration between the agencies with training and some other things bigger than just the two organizations. And I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
So you guys, I believe, did a study with Littleton Fire previously. It was with a South Metro merger. The results of that study never came out. My question is why didn't that come out when the taxpayers paid for it? And my other question is there going to be any secrets in this study that we don't know about?
I believe the study you're referring to was one that involved not South Metro, but Littleton Fire Protection District and Highlands Ranch and Littleton Fire Rescue. Is that about 2 years ago? Yeah. Yeah, we were hired by Littleton Fire Protection District and Highlands Ranch, and it was to look at the options for what they could do to provide service in the area, as well as the contract that exists between Littleton, Highlands Ranch, and Littleton Fire Protection District. The reason that, best of my knowledge, why the report was not released, it was between the clients and the attorney, and there were negotiations that were going on for service, and that was the purpose that this study was used for. And if you're negotiating a contract, that is one of those times where the attorney-client privilege protects some information and why that was done. Subsequent to that, the baseline information that was used in that report for Littleton Fire Rescue, Highlands Ranch, and Littleton Fire Protection District was made available to us to use for this study, which helped keep the cost contained on this. So all the baseline information that you see in here was the same that was used in that. It's only been updated.
My second part of that question is, are you going to withhold any information from us, the citizens, or are you going to release everything you guys find?
Everything that we find, we will turn over to the council, and at that point, it's my understanding that it becomes a public record and it's a public document.
Yeah, I had a question. You talk about time efficiencies coming out of this collaborative effort. What kind of dollar efficiencies do we expect to see out of this? Do you have some ballpark figures at this point?
We don't. We have all of the baseline financials put in, but for each of those strategies, we have not developed a cost avoidance. And that's kind of the term I use rather than savings. Savings to me is you're going to be putting money back into your pocket, and cost avoidance is that next year we're not going to spend quite as much, so we're going to have some cost avoidance. It's not a savings. An example is on capital apparatus. If we're able to align the pumpers and apparatus so they're using similar styles, similar configurations, and buying a type that's more assembly line versus custom made, there's some cost avoidance. There's cost avoidance if they're similar in that you don't stock as many parts. The mechanics don't have to take as much training on different apparatus. They can have some efficiencies there. So the short answer is we don't have the dollar amounts yet. The long answer is we will have some cost avoidance. We know that. I don't know the amount.
Cost avoidance, is there going to be any real dollar savings?
Yeah, they're real dollars because you're not having to spend them. If you maintain the same level of service and you implement a number of the strategies, the cost avoidance will be, yes, you can call it cost savings because you won't be putting out as much.
Well, that raises the question, what part of the budget does this money come out of then?
For
I mean, it remains within the budget for the fire district?
the overall
You're
budget,
saying you're going to spend the money anyway, it sounds like to me, when you talk about cost avoidance.
in some instances, yes, it allows you to adapt so that future increases may not be as much. We know that continuing on the same path, if the increases exceed revenue and the lines cross, there's a problem. You're going to have to make some changes somewhere, possibly not spending as much on capital replacement or deferring maintenance, which at some point you have to pay for anyway, and it becomes more costly. So if you can shift those dollars to that. And the fire departments in the cities are not standalone, independent agencies. There are other needs within the cities that have to be addressed, and And so, being a good steward, they're looking at that as well, is that everybody is under a crunch, so how can we make sure that the pie is big enough to meet the needs of the community?
Well, if we avoid expenditures in one area and it shifts and spent elsewhere, doesn't that get complicated for our sources? For instance, we have Tabor
Yes.
and we have fees, and if some of the savings is reducing fees, you shift that money to another project?
Not
Or
necessarily.
how do you do that once you
Well-
get a multi-district farmed?
There's a formula set up of how the payment is made to operate the organization. Littleton Fire and Rescue is example I believe you're referring to, where Highland Ranch and Littleton Fire Protection District contribute based on a formula. And so whatever the budget is, they contribute an amount based on a formula. If you take the ambulance revenue as one area we dove down into pretty deep, you can see that there have been increases in the fee schedule for EMS transport. The amount of revenue is not keeping pace with that. So if you take the revenue that's going along per call, it's not increasing at the same pace. Why is that? Well, we dig down into it, and we know that write-offs for Medicare, Medicaid, and insurance are not keeping pace. So how do you address that? You have to be able to manage that. And if it is reducing costs somewhere else to be able to maintain that service, that's probably a good thing. I would imagine the community wants to maintain that service. But when you look at the report when it comes out, you'll see that the revenue on return per call is not keeping pace. It isn't increasing because there's been a reduction in the amount that you receive back for the services you provide. So how do you make adjustments for that? So if you can do something over on A to help you on B, that's a good thing.
How many sources of revenue are there supporting the district?
Are you speaking of Highland Ranch, Littleton Fire Protection District, or?
Let's just talk about Littleton for the time being.
I'm sorry?
Littleton.
The city of Littleton? A myriad, from property tax and sales tax, fees for service. There are quite a few of different areas. I don't know the exact number.
It sounds sticky to me.
It sounds what?
Sticky. Well, I mean, if you're going to reduce, if you have a true reduction in cost, and you're getting sources from fees and from property taxes, et cetera, those are handled and ruled differently on.
Yes, there are different rules on how they're handled. That's correct.
So if you have some real cost savings, you have to divide it up and say, this is Tabor and this is fees and et cetera. You see where I'm going?
I do, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Wanted to make just a comment about and it goes back, I think, to your first question about cost avoidance and what all's going on there. A couple of examples. Looking at your own home and your property, as far as cost avoidance, if you find that you're routinely spending $400 or $500 a year on spot repairs to your roof, and you're getting tired of that and say, well, isn't there a different way to do this? And you go out and you find that for, $2,000 or whatever, you can fix the whole roof. That's a cost outlay that you got to come up with, that $2,000. But the expectation is that then you won't be paying $200-300 a year to fix the roof every year for some period of time. So you've avoided that routine cost by some capital investment. So that's one example. I think going to your process question about where we are and the recommendations, I think in the economy we live in, I've seen at least families that have decided where they were, different units of the family were living apart, and now they decided to come and live together on one roof because they couldn't afford to live independently any longer. And so they began to look at, what are the costs of living apart? What are the costs of moving under the same roof? If we're living independently, this is what the water bill is. If you go from 2 people in the house to 8 people in the house, what happens to the water bill? And we're at that phase where we're trying to identify all the issues that are associated with potential moves and changes. And we haven't finalized the cost impacts yet. And part of this is the work just physically hasn't been done yet because we're not that far along. The other part is wanting to get some sense of citizen input. And my final thought in relation to this, in a different venue, we were talking to a public group like this, not Martin, but I was with another colleague, and we were talking to them about the fact that their 90 percentile response times were ranging in the 7 to 8 minutes. And there was at least some discussion with the elected officials and others that they wanted to reduce that. And so we were talking to the public about the cost or ways in which we could improve the response time and get the 90 percentile down to maybe 5 minutes, what the cost impacts of that. And a couple of people spoke up and said, well, we would like to know what the cost difference would be if we went from 7 to 8 minutes up to 10 minutes, because we might be willing to take that and spend less money on that. Now, that took me back a little bit. I was a little surprised at that. But that's some of the issues that we're encountering as we deal with the public. So I understand, I don't feel like we have a good answer for your question other than the financial work is not complete yet, so we can't tell you today. We expect to be able to tell you when the report is completed. If you choose this option, if you choose to go this, if you decide to not consolidate, but if you decide to go through a cooperative service process with training, here's what you need to do, not just to save dollars, but to provide a good level of training that meets the laws and the requirements, keeps your personnel safe. Here's what you can do. There's going to be some efficiencies here. You're going to spend a little bit here, and here's the net change. So that we hope to have that, expect to have that part of it. It's just not there yet. Does that help a little bit more, or are we still missing your point?
That helps, but, you're talking a department that spends money on equipment and wages. So the only way you're going to save money is by cutting the number of personnel that you have, which is either reducing the fire station or reducing administration. Or you're going to cut cost on equipment. And if you have the same number of stations, I don't know how much money you're going to be able to save on equipment.
Okay.
People would buy the same fire truck, and Wilson buying the same fire truck, isn't going to change a lot.
Okay. I'm sorry, I apologize.
I'm done now. Well, the department runs on wages and capital costs. So if you're going to save money, you're talking a reduction in personnel, and that only comes from reducing the number of stations or reducing the administration. And equipment cost, if you have the same number of stations, I don't see how you're going to save on equipment costs. Standardizing fire trucks, engines between Inglewood and Littleton doesn't change how often you have to replace them. You still need an engine in each one of the stations. You need an ambulance in 5 of the stations. It doesn't change how many you have. So if we're looking to consolidate together and we're not talking about reducing personnel, then we're not really getting any efficiencies. And changing the governance without changing the number of personnel or your replacement schedule and equipment isn't going to save any money.
Did you hear that okay then? Okay, all right.
There-
One of- Go ahead, Mark.
There are some potentials even for a reduction in force. Will we lay off and say, lay off people? Probably not. I can't see that. But we have a number of individuals that will be retiring. They're in the drop system where they're going to need to retire. And the efficiencies from that, it's an opportunity where you can gain a benefit in administration or staffing. Also, back on the apparatus, sure, buying similar apparatus is only a smaller savings. But if you have a fire department that has 2 pumpers or 3 pumpers, you have to have 1 reserve. Whether you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, you got to have 1 reserve to meet standards. So if you've got 2 departments that have got multiple reserves and you don't have to replace one of those reserves, I think $500,000–600,000 of not having to replace a pumper is a fairly substantial amount of money. And so that's one of those efficiencies on apparatus too. If you bring your apparatus together and you need 3 pumpers in reserve instead of 5, or 3 instead of 4, I'll take that savings every day of the week. So those are some of the others too. There's a timing and an opportunity here that may not come along again. Maybe this isn't the right time, but we will answer that question and provide best of our ability the numbers of the cost savings or cost avoidance from those.
Other questions? Yeah. One of the things, in my experience as a fire chief over a number of years, is when you have a staff person that deals with particular tasks that related to the number of people in the organization, and the more people you have, the larger that job gets. That's not a real area to look at. When you have a staff person that's responsible for an area that really does not correlate directly to how many people there are. It could be an EMS administration, or it could be training administration, or it could be emergency management, or those types of things, that whether the employee group is 60 or 160, the work is still basically the same. There may be more delivery points, but when you have 2 or 3 different organizations, and each one has a staff person doing that same function across the organizations, when you can bring those organizations together and say, for this particular area, we can now do this with 1 person, there is a cost reduction there. And I think the other comment that I'd make is what your elected officials are facing is the reality of service reductions. We're at the point where we say, the money's not there. The only way we can reduce your costs or stay within the budget is to reduce staffing, as you said, close stations, reduce staff or whatever, which means a lower level of service. And I think this is a well-placed venture to say, are there any other alternatives that we can take to avoid doing that, to keep the service level where the public would like it to be, and yet not increase taxes. So, do you have anybody on the? We have people that have signed up here. I don't know if there are no more questions, we'll move to public comment section, which is where you can offer your opinions on direction for your community. Vicki? Did I get that right? Pete Webb? Pete, come on. Here you go. Oh, use the podium. Okay.
Good evening. I'm Peter Webb, a citizen of Littleton residing at 4497 Westbury Avenue. I'm here to speak in favor of the consolidation of the Littleton and Englewood Fire Departments as a benefit to Littleton and Englewood citizens and a model for municipal cooperation. Allow me to state some of my qualifications, and it will become clear why I believe the consolidation or merger of these agencies is a good thing. I have 18 years of service on the Fire Protection District Board level, 11 years on the Littleton Fire Protection District Board, and 8 years on the South Metro Fire Rescue Board. My last 2 years on South Metro, I was board chairman. I am one of the architects of the merger of South Metro and Parker Fire, which created the 5th largest professional fire service agency in the state of Colorado. I was vice chairman of the newly created governing agency, the South Metro Fire Rescue Authority, for 2 years. I and Parker chairman Ken Molson have made appearances around the country detailing the success of the South Metro merger. In my business practice, I advise fire rescue and ambulance districts. I'm a former board member of the Special District Association of Colorado and was board president for 3 years. I have participated in the mergers of fire rescue agencies, and I am presently involved in the merger of the ambulance districts in Eagle County. Now to the merger of Littleton and Englewood. There are affirmative business and philosophical reasons to merge these two agencies. There will be demonstrated efficiencies in providing services and in purchasing administrative costs and support services. The two departments already cooperate in training and lately inspections and life safety. Once you add dispatch, recruitment, and most importantly, field operations, the ability to respond to full-scale emergencies with experience and redundancy will show marked improvement. From a business standpoint, there is no good reason for two competing fire departments with stations 2 miles apart to not be combined. From a philosophical standpoint, the days of municipal fiefdoms should end. City boundaries are artificial lines, and cooperation between cities should be the norm, not the exception. If we can improve response times with well-trained and equipped personnel while saving valuable taxpayer-provided funds, should we not do that? If we can secure a new career structure for the firefighters and paramedics, preserving their years of service while giving younger members, female and male, the opportunity to advance, why not do that? If we can set an example for other cities and other fire rescue agencies about efficiency, cooperation, and the opportunity to use our funding wisely, why not do that? And for those of you who noticed, the small city of Edgewater voted yesterday to merge its volunteer department with the professional Wheat Ridge Fire Protection District. It's hard for me to imagine a reason not to consolidate these two services in Littleton and Englewood. Citizens will continue to receive superior service and, in some cases, better response times without being asked for additional funding to make it all work. A key issue will be identity. What are we going to call ourselves? That's what the firefighters are asking. Yes, the identity, the brand, will be important. Creating a new fire rescue authority with the brand United South Fire Rescue Authority will send the strongest message that the elected leaders of Englewood and Littleton have taken steps to improve service capabilities and operate with efficiency. But let's not stop here. It makes sense for these two cities to merge their public works departments, and yes, even their police departments. These times of taxpayer awareness and municipal resourcefulness should be the reason to look for efficiency wherever we can create it. A final note, the planning consultant we used at South Metro is the same consultant you have selected, ESCI and Jack Snook. He has not asked me for this plug, but I will tell you. The merger plan Jack and his team wrote set the right approach, the right timetable, and the right tone for a successful merger. Follow his playbook, and things will work out just fine. As a Littleton resident, I thank you for this opportunity to make my thoughts known.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. I have Marty Borosek.
My resume is not as long as the first gentleman's. My name is Marty Brezak, and I'm in District 4 in the city of Littleton. My model for the city is for the city to provide fire protection, police protection, roads and drainage, and water and sewer. When you start combining those things, it gets a little bit iffy. we've got experience now with the water and sewer plant because we have a joint Littleton Englewood wastewater treatment plant, and it's not working too well. We're paying the bills, and it's being run and operated by an Englewood Water and Sewer Board. The fact is, my sewer rates have gone up incrementally every year for the last 7 years. So we have some experience there. Now, if the city can do a joint and cooperative effort with the existing staff and the existing resources and save us money, that would be good. It's a big challenge because there's a lot of egos in the fire department, as I know, but I'll give them a chance to try that. However, what was not spoken about was a separate fire district today. I mean, you said it, but you really didn't go through a lot of the fire district. And that's where I have a real major concern. Because I look at that and I say, well, gee, there's double management there. I think Doug brought up the personnel. We've already abrogated our responsibility, we, the city of Littleton, have abrogated our responsibility to operating that sewage treatment plant. And if we do this and set up a fire district that's going to be a tax entity by itself, that's another layer of management that we're going to create, but yet still have in the city of Littleton. So my recommendation there would be to, and I'm sorry Michael Penny left, but to cut his salary by a third or maybe even a half, and every director that is associated with the fire department, such as the finance department, the IT department, dispatch, human resources, should all be reduced by a significant amount, a third or maybe even a half. Because we don't have that responsibility anymore. It's going to be coming from that other tax entity. Oh, and we can even reduce the salaries of the city council because they won't have to deal with firemen's contracts anymore or anything like that. As far as Pete was going, he was going down the road where, gee, if it's good enough for the fire department, it may be good enough for the police department. Well, I think we've experienced that when Chief Moss retired. There was a consideration to have the police department in Littleton come under Arapahoe County. Where does the city stop being a city? That's my question. We need to have a city manager, a city council, and control of our own budgets. Now, my second point was if we do go to this special district, I would strongly recommend that it lives under the rule of Tabor. We are still under the Tabor rule. We haven't detabored or debruced, however you want to say it. So if the fire department gets their original budget, they can't start creeping or expanding or advancing without coming to the citizens. I hope that's the case. And, another thing is, I would also put in no COPs, certificates of participation. That's the way the city can get around Tabor by incurring long-term debt. Give them a budget and let them live with that budget. Okay? So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Kim McAndrews. Okay. Mike Brill. Jean, I can't read the last name. Okay, Jean. Scott Osmond. Okay. I've got David, but I can't read, lives on Cayley Avenue in Littleton. No? Okay. Norm Brown. Gary Sears. Okay. Cindy Hathaway. Cindy, no. Jerry Rhodes. Governor, sir. Okay. Marty Bolt. Okay. And Carol Brizek. There we go. You like the handheld or the? Okay.
I'm Carol Brizek, and I live in the 4th District. I know that this is just getting started, but as a citizen who's paid attention, Marty's right. The Inglewood sewer has not been a good deal for us as citizens. We have a sewage treatment plant that we went into debt for, $50 million, that we did not need the expansion of, and now we're all paying for it because, they were going to build it and everybody was supposed to come. Well, everybody didn't come. So those of us that are here get to pick up the tab. It's a board that, as citizens, we have no representation on. And I can just see this going that same way, that we'll have a fire district combined with Littleton and Inglewood. Citizens won't have the input. And right now we do have input. We have a council that we can come to. I chose to live in Littleton. I didn't choose to live in Inglewood. And I think that I chose to be here for a very good reason. I didn't want to live in Inglewood. I wanted to live here. And I believe our government is here to provide us the basic needs of welfare and safety and our roads. I take issue with a couple of things that I heard, that the resources are dwindling for the fire department, and the only way to get around it is to consolidate. Well, there are other expenses in our city budget that can be cut if that's really the problem. This doesn't have to be the solution. I want it to be cost neutral. I have a feeling that this might be the first step of our fire departments combining, and then perhaps a district being formed where they're completely cut away from us and they get their own funding mechanism, which means we as taxpayers will end up having to pay for them with a mill levy on our property taxes. If that's the way this is going, and we know that this has kind of been talked about for years in the city of Littleton, then I would like to see that the mill levy that the city is collecting that funds the fire department right now just be shifted over to fund the fire district. I have a feeling that this is a way of creating another revenue stream for our city. It's a shell game. So I think we all have to be really cautious of what's going on and pay attention to find out where the money is, because it always comes down to money.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Okay. If you chose not to speak tonight, but you still would like to have input, I've got some business cards up here through ESCI. You can send me an email. You can give me a call. Martin, I think you have some cards as well. I'd be more than happy to give you that avenue that you can contact us by. With that being said, I want to thank you again very much for being here, for taking the time to do this, and look forward to coming back when we can present the finished product and carry this one step forward to a decision point for your elected officials. Thank you, good night, and be safe.